So here are some examples of the federal government exploiting the states, some would argue. This first one, I can make it change page again. The federal government will often offer money to the individual states using the power of the purse of Congress on condition that they do certain things. For example, this isn't actually on the PowerPoint. In 1984, Congress passed a law to say that it would withdraw up to 10% of federal funding to the individual states for highways unless they raised the drinking age to 21. Now, the 21st Amendment of the Constitution, the one that said that prohibition was wrong and got rid of that amendment, the 21st Amendment said that the states had full control over alcohol laws. So Congress couldn't raise the drinking age to 21 without the approval of the states. And so what they did was, as I've just said, they basically said, unless you comply with what we want, then we'll not pay for your federal roads, we'll knock down the budget, so you'll have big potholes in highways and things like that, which would be really unpopular. The Supreme Court sided with the federal government, a case called South Dakota versus Dole, where they actually said, yeah, the federal government is fine, it's the power of the purse, etc., etc. So that is seen as an example from the 1980s of Congress using its power of the purse, if you like, to bully the states into doing what it wants. Another example is money being used the other way, I suppose. In 2009, Obama created an education program which was called Race to the Top. And the aim of this was to try and raise education standards in the United States. Now, again, this fits into the morals part of the powers given to the states. That's where education kind of fits into. And so states have a predominant role over educating their citizens. Race to the Top wanted to improve education standards, so it's a national federal program. And basically what they did, they said to the states, we will give you a slice of $4.3 billion if you comply with the various things required for Race to the Top. If they didn't meet these 20 educational goals, which the federal government kind of said, this is what we're going to give you, then they didn't get the slice of their $4.3 billion. And Obama's not the only one. George W. Bush in 2001 passed an education bill which again set things like national tests, national standards, again in exchange for money to the states. So whereas the first example was Congress saying, was bullying the states, saying we won't give you money unless you do what we want, this one, I wouldn't quite say it was bribery, I never ran it in an essay, but they're basically saying, here's a lot of cash, if you do what we want, you can have a slice of it. Here's an example of the states being forced to comply with the federal government against their wishes. As we know, the states have the right to administer elections in their states as they please. So, as I said before, some states have early voting, some states do this, some states do that. In 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, which basically said that some states were too racist to do this, and that these states will be overseen by the federal government in Washington, D.C. And if they wish to change how they did their electoral practices, they need permission from Washington, D.C. to do this. This was law from 1965 onwards, and it wasn't until 2013 when the Supreme Court declared that that was unconstitutional. The case is called Shelby County versus Holder. Okay, and this has then allowed states, as a consequence of this, to pass laws which many liberals say have been denying black people, in particular, the right to vote. Things like voter ID laws have been introduced as a consequence in some states, etc., etc. Okay, so state rights and the federal government rights, federalism, is really contentious in today's politics. It's the heart of the division of the two main parties. The Republican Party often claim they support state rights. The Democrat Party often claim that they tend to support the federal government's right to do things, So it's a really issue of great contention between the two parties and in American politics. So many conservatives, with a small c, argue that the federal government has got too big. Okay, this is not what the founding fathers intended. The federal government, they say, is sticking its beak into far too many issues. Why are they doing things like race to the top? Why is the federal government being involved in all various things? They say it should be cut down to size and with those laws and powers returned back to the states. Many liberals, in contrast, argue the federal government is needed to protect people's rights from the individual states. They say, why is it illegal in some states, or was illegal in some states, to have a same-sex marriage but was legal elsewhere? Surely it's an example of the federal government ensuring the founding fathers' intentions were fulfilled by allowing all states and all citizens to have the same rights. They also claim the federal government isn't really all that big either. It's kind of exaggerated by many conservatives because the vast majority of laws passed in the United States are passed at state level. Hence why there's all these differences. If the federal government was that big, then you wouldn't have all these differences between the states. Now, one thing to think about in terms of the comparison questions are what are the similarities between federalism and devolution, and what are the differences between federalism and devolution. So if I just give you a moment or two to have a think about that, so press pause, have a think, and I'll come back and I'll suggest some points for it. Okay, so some potential points for this one. If we do about differences, first of all, because remember, devolution in the UK is when power's been given or granted to places like Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So in terms of differences, you could argue that federalism is constitutionally protected by the entrenched constitution, whereas devolution is at the mercy of parliamentary sovereignty. So there's no way, for example, that Washington DC could actually take away the powers of the states significantly, unless they did a constitutional amendment. But there's nothing to stop the UK Parliament from closing down the Scottish Parliament and stuff. And in fact, it's done so in the past. So it closed down the Northern Ireland Assembly in the 1970s. It shut down the GLC, the Greater London Council, in the mid-1980s. Other differences, you could argue that federalism is fairly fixed, i.e. it's been there since 1787, fundamentally unaltered. Whereas devolution is a growing new concept in the UK. It's only emerged, hasn't it, in recent decades. So federalism is fixed and kind of unchanging, it's not changing, it's kind of fixed and hasn't changed a great deal. Devolution is something relatively new in Britain and evolving. You could have another difference being that federalism is symmetrical. Every state has got the same powers. Whereas devolution was asymmetrical. So Scotland have far greater powers than Wales or Northern Ireland, for example. I know those things are beginning to change, but even so, Scotland still has got far more powers than the other two nations. So federalism is symmetrical, devolution is asymmetrical. Another difference might be, you might argue that federalism, in some ways, state rights are being eroded, with powers more and more going to the federal government to Washington DC, whereas devolution, you could say, is going the other way. The government in London is giving more and more powers away to the devolved institutions. So therefore, from the top of my head, there are probably others, okay, but therefore that stick in my mind. In terms of similarities, you could argue that under both federalism and devolution, the national government, Washington and London, maintain control over defence and foreign policy. That's a similarity. You could argue that both federalism and devolution enable local politicians, i.e. those in the Scottish Parliament, those in the North Dakota legislature, to make decisions which affect just their citizens. In other words, they're they're making decisions which affect a smaller group of people, which then leads to differences across the nation. So, you know, Scotland has baby boxes, Wales doesn't do. Nevada allows marijuana use for medicinal and recreational purposes. Texas doesn't. So that's a similarity. Okay. A third similarity, trying to think now, is that you could say that Scottish devolution, and I think Wales as well as of next year with their new powers, will allow financial and taxation differences to occur, which is also true of every single state in the United States. So there's another similarity. There are probably others, okay? They're just three that I just thought of between them. So again, beware of that type of question in the exam, and I will do either a video or I'll do it in a lesson. I'll explain in some detail how you actually answer questions on the comparative stuff for politics. So that is federalism done, and then next week I'm going to do in the team session, or I don't know, at some point anyway, we're going to evaluate federalism next week.